All right, Practice Any Fam Jam. We have a legend on the podcast today. A legend. And her name is Dr. Dev. And she is one of the most magical beings in the universe. And that is not hyperbole. It's fucking real. So welcome the one and only queen, Dr. Devin Banks. Dr. Dev has a PhD in psychology, but more than that, she's just fucking magical. She used to teach at Practice ND. She's an amazing practitioner, athlete, human. I could go on, but you will probably do a better job of giving your cool titles that the world needs to know. So can you share, Dr. Dev, a little bit about yourself?
Yes, like you said, my name is Devin. I recently got my PhD in clinical psychology, and I am a professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, which took me away from Indy, but I'm glad to be close so I can come visit anytime. I teach right now. I'm teaching a course on multiculturalism and psychology this semester, and then another huge part of my job is research. So my research concerns improving health equity in mental health and the consequences related to mental health, specifically focused on youth and youth of color. And then the other part of my job is I am a clinically trained psychologist. So a lot of my work up to this point has been seeing patients and helping people individually and in groups. So, and a lot of that work has been focused on substance use, addiction, and trauma for both youth and adults.
When you list all that out, it sounds like you're 55.
I have had a lot of jobs all at the same time, definitely. Many roles.
God, you're so smart. Ugh. Okay, so this week we're talking about mukta, which is the liberation that already exists within us. So those who are listening may have heard the word jiva mukta, which is, it means being liberated whilst alive. So when we read through the Yoga Sutras, this concept of liberation comes up in many different words and languages, or not languages, it's just the one, but many different words. And there's sort of this underlying tension and question left in the Yoga Sutras, which is, can we be liberated in this life? And I think juxtaposed to liberation is always bondage, right? And I personally think we're living through, we could argue that we're always in a state of bondage, right? But I think the pandemic, 2020 being the cutest, loudest dumpster fire I've ever seen, has definitely made the reality of our bondage in so many different capacities, I think, amplified. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective as a psychologist, what you are seeing from a mental perspective, collectively, individually, what are you experiencing and seeing, in that realm of liberated mindset versus bound mindset?
Yeah, I think people, when we think about freedom, when we think about liberation, as Americans or in American society, we think about control. And so I think one thing that we're seeing, with coronavirus, is a loss of control and people, grabbing at straws to find that sense of control again. And so the reason I think, let me go back a little bit, the reason I think freedom to us means control is because if you think about the ideals this country was founded on and what we mean by freedom, we think about democracy, right? So what the American Revolution was really about, not being under the thumb of the British monarchy, right? And letting people have control over their leaders, like their and now that turns out to be our elected officials, right? Like this idea of democracy is about having control over who our leaders are. And if you think about how we're taught, when our freedom is taken away or is at risk of being taken away, what are we taught to do? We're taught to fight for it. Like that's the thing that we fight for, right? To get that freedom, to get that control back. And that I think is really problematic because when we conflate freedom and control, because control is an illusion. Like we don't have control. Like this world it's just chaos, and our brains are so amazing. They are programmed to help us survive. And one of the main things they need to do to help us survive is make us think that we have control over our lives so that we can like feed ourselves and prevent ourselves from danger, right? Imagine if we didn't have that illusion of control, we would all just like lay on the ground and be like, well, I'll just wait for it to all be over. Like nothing matters anyways, right?
Like me in my sweatpants right now.
Right. So we need that ego to tell us that we have control so that we, will take care of ourselves, and make quote unquote good or healthy decisions. But that can go a little bit too far, that hold on control. And then we get, I think, in a position where we are grasping for that sense of control when we are thrown into chaos or trauma, right? So, freedom from like a psychological perspective, I think it's the same thing. People, when they want to be free of their, of whatever like ailments they feel like are impacting their mind, what they really mean is they want to have control over their mind. Like they want to be able to control. I hear people say all the time, I want to get my depression under control. I want to get my anxiety under control. But if freedom and control are about fighting, like I'm telling you, you are not going to be able to fight. You cannot fight depression. You cannot fight anxiety. Like fighting is not, despite what we've been taught, fighting is not the way to freedom.
Oof. Just shook me a little. So I think there are three concepts that came up that I think is really an interesting distinguishing factor when we talk about freedom from the lens of yoga and mentality, which is ahamkara, which you said, like we can't divorce ourselves of our like baseline ego, that we have to exist. And ahamkara is like, it's our white blood cells coming in to do the work to fight infection. We have to have that balance to stay alive and to keep moving. But then there's asmita, which is the actual I-ness or the ego, which then we start to use to inflict dominion over others or environment, or, I think that's where that starts to get a little ugly. And then there's aparigraha, which is the opposite of non-clinging. It is non-clinging, but when we step into more of like the I self, and we start to cling and think things belong to us and start to own them and, to your point, control them. So I think that's where that slippery slope goes, especially the more agency that's taken from us. So I'm curious, because depression and anxiety, especially in the spiritual world, I think we get a lot of like spiritual bypassing in terms of like, oh, just let it go, or and I'd imagine telling someone who has depression, to not, like, how would you explain to someone who is maybe experiencing depression or anxiety during this time or just in general, how would you maybe explain to them not to fight it? Like, what would be a tactic or a strategy instead of fighting it? What would that look like?
Well, I think, and this is very yogic of me, but I always do, I tell my patients, like, awareness is the first step, right? And I don't mean being like, okay, fine, like put a label on it, I have depression. That's not what I mean at all. I mean awareness of your patterns of thinking. Like you can't change anything or move forward until you have awareness of it. And so a lot of my approach is pretty mindful. Like I'm not asking you to change your thought patterns or like change your emotional patterns, but just start to be aware of them. Because once you're aware of them, you'll start to notice, wow, when people say this type of thing, you know, I tend to get really anxious, like, or, you know, man, like every time my boss asked me to do this task, this like particular type of task, like these certain thoughts come up, right? And you kind of start putting things together so that you can put some things, you start to learn things, so you can put some things into place to mitigate those, right? So like if every time your boss asks you to do this certain task, you start to have really self-defeating negative thoughts, then what can you put in the middle there? Like, you know, how do you take care of yourself? Like, because you know your boss is going to keep asking you these things, you know, like you that's your job. You're not, I mean, I don't think right this second you're quitting, but you know, what are like the self-care strategies or the self-talk strategies, you know, or the things that you need to do if you're being self-defeating to make yourself feel powerful in the moment so that you can go do what you need to do, right? And that's a huge oversimplification of like the whole long process, but you know, I would say that the first step is really a mindful awareness. And you know, sometimes mindful awareness get help, not necessarily from a professional, but you know, from someone similar or from a friend you can talk things out with, so you can figure out what your path forward is.
Yeah, what I heard in that, which I find really interesting and healing, is the essentially the disruption of the pattern. You know, like we get into patterns of thought, we get into patterns of behavior based off of those thoughts, which from like a, you know, a yogic lens, that's karma, right? Like karma is predictable. Karma is basically looking at the world and saying like, we can basically predict how this is going to go. You know, it's also like analyzing history. If we take a second, become aware of the patterns that we humans continue to adopt, if we would just take a second and look at where we've been and make a different choice, make a choice to disrupt the pattern, we can have different outcomes, which I think is a really powerful thing to consider.
Yeah, and I don't want to undermine anybody's experience because there's all different types of things that contribute to like depression and anxiety and all other, you know, those are obviously just, I think, the most common that we talk about and some of the most common, but I think if you're in a crap situation, which almost all of us are right now, having symptoms like of depression, anxiety are super normal. And we can't do too much to change like our crap situations. So, you know, what can we do? And I mean, and this stuff is all over the internet, you know, about, and I don't even want to use self-care because I think it's overused, but, you know, how to manage anxiety in the land of COVID, or, you know, what you can do to mitigate some of the stress related to the racism and racial trauma that is like all over the news. So I guess I would just tell people that this is super normal, that like, you know, I'm bummed, I'm down, like it sucks. I think a lot of people are. And that's normal. And, you know, I don't know exactly, you know, I don't know how we're going to come out of this. Like, I think there's going to be a lot of, effects of this time, and some are going to be amazing and some are going to be awful. But I think one thing I've learned is that we have to ask for help. Like, we have to ask each other for help. And that feels, again, back to my point, like a loss of control to a lot of us, giving away our power, giving away our control, giving away our freedom. But it is so necessary if we have to lean on each other.
And yeah, and in a way that is, well, two things that are breaking a pattern there. One, I think, you saying like, this sucks and this is the way it is. I think we're just constantly looking to always, I think it's brain science that we are constantly looking for pleasure and avoiding pain, right? But maybe that's the pattern as evolved beings we have to break, is it's sometimes there's pain. Sometimes we have to deal with the pain. And again, as you said, not to minimize people's experience, if you've been experiencing a lot of pain for a continuing amount of time, like, that might be a different thing altogether. But collectively, those of us who maybe aren't suffering from deep depression, we might just have to sit with the pain. So I think that's one thing that honestly is a disruption in the pattern, because the pattern is seek pleasure at all costs.
Yeah.
And the second thing is empowering ourselves to ask for help, which we're a country that's taught to be the helper. I've just listened to this podcast on the Korean War and how we've stepped in different wars to help. And while I don't want to diminish some of our assistance to other countries in our history, we certainly have. Also, sometimes what our help has been is murdering people.
Yeah.
Right. So I think being okay with, as Americans, like, we damn welfare and things like that too, like help programs, I think it breaks the pattern to ask for help and to be empowered to ask for help, instead of thinking we're holier than thou and we don't need help, I guess.
Yeah, your insight about breaking the pattern is so important. I think, and it goes back to this idea of freedom, because so much of being an adult psychologically is unlearning and unlearning the socialization that you experienced growing up. I mean, obviously some of the socialization is positive, but so much of it is not helpful or, biased. And so much of being an adult is unlearning that and breaking those patterns, like getting rid of, starting to smooth out some of those samskaras, those patterns, ways of being, of thinking, of feeling that were ingrained in us very young. And, we hear people talk a lot about like dealing with their own traumas. And, trauma is a word that I think is being used now a lot more than it was even 10 years ago. And so it can mean different things, but what I think they're really saying when we talk about trauma more broadly is unlearning patterns, like, and it could be anything. Like, I am working to unlearn, the respectability politics that was socialized into me from a young age to, like, quote unquote survive in the white world, right? A lot of white people right now are working on unlearning like the racist socialization that they received growing up. Like, if you experienced abuse or trauma growing up, you were taught that certain things that we might think are adaptive, someone else who didn't experience that thinks is adaptive, you might have learned that those are really bad, right? And so you have to work to unlearn and deprogram what you learned. Like, so part of freedom is freedom from from our negative socialization, from our traumatic learnings as children and adolescents, and throughout. I don't mean to be like Freud, like repressed desires about it, like everything's about childhood, because it's not. But we can't get away, we can't escape the culture, the society, the ideals that we were raised in, that we were raised around, that our minds were shaped around. And so I think a lot of being an adult is working to unlearn those things. And that's why awareness is the first step. And I think that plays right into the idea of freedom, because you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, or alluded to it, but like mukta is like past tense. Mm-hmm. So some Sanskrit scholars believe that it's talking about a freedom, like not a freedom that we need to achieve, but like a freedom that we've already had, that we've already experienced, and that we need to go back to. It's like all of the crap that has been piled on us up until this point in our lives is preventing us from that freedom, from that knowing. Mm-hmm. And this is something that sticks with me, that someone said, Purvi has talked several times about yoga being a deep remembrance of like our essence of who we really are, and getting back to that. And I think all of these things are connected. It's all kind of different ways of saying the same thing, which is that this esoteric idea of freedom, we might not be able to put our finger on it, but the path is unlearning and deprogramming that which is clearly not helpful to us. And so I guess that's why, to me, the first step is always awareness. It's always mindfulness.
As a yoga teacher, what are some tools that you think are useful to people to engage with that first step, to become aware?
I like the 16-second check-in. Do you know that one?
No.
It's where you literally take 4 in breaths, hold for 4, 4 out breaths, hold for 4. That's it. It's literally, that's it. And you can do it anywhere, you can do it anytime. And like, whenever it comes to mind, just do it. Taking a pause. The other thing that I tell both my patients and my mother, because she needs a reminder, especially when she's dealing with technology, is like you have to back up from whatever you're struggling with, right? So like if you are working on something and you're really kind of focused on the details and you get frustrated or it's not working out for you, you keep pushing and pushing and pushing and drilling down, right? But like the devil is in the details. You need to like roll your figurative office chair back and like take a more landscaped 1,000-foot view. Like take a moment to like take the whole picture into perspective, and maybe then there'll be a clearer answer and it's not where you had drilled down before.
I was kind of afraid to say it earlier because I didn't want it to be oversimplification, but I think for anyone not maybe dealing with extreme anxiety or depression, something to just break the pattern is like go for a walk. Like take 10 minutes, 5 minutes and go for a walk. Or yeah, exactly what you're saying, like zoom out, change scenery, set a timer if you have to, but just do something else and then come back to it, which I've been doing that because we were talking about before this, like I can't work for an hour straight now. Like I just feel so fucked in the head. And so what I do is I set a timer and then I go in my garden or I'll go and, cook something. I'll do something that's a totally different activity, usually has to do with like, I have to touch something and, less thinking, more doing.
Mm-hmm.
It has really helped. So those are awesome.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's this, as a researcher, we're like always obsessed with how do you be more productive? Stupid. But the like evidence-based productivity thing that's pretty popular right now is this tomato timer. So the idea is you work for 25 minutes and then you take a 5-minute break, and then you work for 25 minutes and then you take a 10-minute break, and then you like repeat that. And if you can actually get, for me, if I can actually get myself to like follow what the timer says, the breaks really help me kind of take that more 1,000-foot view, because maybe I've like gotten into the trenches with something and I'm really struggling, and a 5 or 10-minute break and I come back and I'm like, this is a waste of time. Like, I need to be working on something else. So, we're talking about like work and doing stuff, but I think that can apply to like the way you talk to yourself, the conversations or the automatic thoughts that are happening in your head, the anxiety talk when your thoughts just kind of like tumble over each other, right? So there are many applications.
Well, and I think the external always, informs the internal and vice versa. So if you can find a break in the pattern, which causes some freedom in your mind, or you literally free your body from the situation, it may often have the effect of a brief moment of freedom or respite in your mind. And over time, like unlearning to relearn or unlearning to remember, as you shared earlier, may be the ticket.
Yeah, exactly.
I would love to know 2 more things. Actually, 3 more. I have a special question at the end. So do you feel as a yogi, as a researcher, as a psychologist, as a teacher, do you think that freedom in this existing body, do you think liberation is possible?
I think it depends on what liberation means to you. I think liberation is possible in the moment. I think liberation is possible from like an emotion or a way of thinking or a way of being, but everything is temporary. So I think when the idea of like looking for this liberation that's going to save us is why we're in the political situation that we're in right now. It's not realistic. Everything is temporary. And nobody can save us from ourselves. Like, it's our responsibility. Our community is our responsibility. Okay, so yes, and it's temporary.
Yeah, that kind of gives me hope in a weird way,
Mm-hmm.
My last question would be in line with that in your research. So we're going to be doing, I think the week that this comes out, we'll start it, but we're doing a book club on My Grandmother's Hands, which is about racial trauma. As I'm saying that for people listening, you know that. But could you speak to just a little bit about your research, and I'll let you choose who you want to address. But, what in this moment with the racial tension that we have and the opportunity to actually break old patterns and create new liberties, what do you see might be some actions that either people of color can take or white people can take to, from a psychological standpoint, to break these patterns? And again, you can choose who you want to, share or speak to in that.
Yeah. There's just so much. There's so many things. I think that we are struggling with a lack of empathy in general. And like race as a concept is very difficult to people who don't have to consider their race, which is like white people. So then the idea of there being trauma or like vicarious trauma, even if it didn't happen to you specifically, is a really difficult concept when you don't even really get race in the first place. But, I'll talk about it like this: as a community. Like if you live in Indianapolis and, you've lived in downtown Indy, or, you've lived in the Indianapolis area your whole life, and, something like what happened in Lebanon happens there. Like, something really bad happens to the community of Indianapolis. Like, even if you are not hurt and no one you know personally is hurt, like you are really going to feel that, right? Because you identify with and are attached to this community. And so when people are brought together by something like where they live, a shared identity, they can feel it when something bad happens to that community. And when people are oppressed systematically, and they create like a subculture, which Black Americans of the African diaspora have done, when something happens to us, and it keeps happening, even if it's not someone we know personally, we really feel that, right? And so, and then we're like expected to, go to work and be just productive as we were being, the previous day. And so I think, something beautiful that's happened the last couple of days is that the NBA, like several NBA players and other athletes, women athletes included, are like, no, we're not doing this. Like, we're not going to work. Like, we're not going to pretend like everything is normal in our outer lives when everything is like falling down in our inner lives, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's what we have to continue to do, is to say, no, like we're not going about this. We're not just going to keep on keeping on. And we're not just going to keep on keeping on and say, oh, that's so sad for Black people, or like, oh, that's so sad for this one person, who was shot by the police, or whatever the incident may be. But we're going to stop what we're doing until this, and whatever that looks like for you, until this is resolved. And so, take that as you may, but I think it's like the trauma, the vicarious trauma of seeing these people that look like you get killed because they look like you, right? On top of then having to go to a majority white workplace, as most, not most, but as many, most Black people do. And nobody seems to care. Mm-hmm. Right. So like going back to my original example, like, if something horrible happened in your Indianapolis community and like you got on a Zoom call with your family that lives in California and they're like, woohoo, everything's amazing, we love our lives, and you're sad, you're gonna be like, woo, this isn't really meshing up with what's going on with me. Like, did you not hear about what happened in Indianapolis, right? Mm-hmm. It's weird. And we've all experienced this to some extent. But because race is so politicized, and because it's such a difficult concept for people who don't have to deal with race to conceive of, it's harder.
Yeah. I think what you said too is so critical to your earlier point about control and breaking the pattern. You know, the control is sticking with the programming. You know, like an incident occurs, but we stick with the programming. We go to work, we do the fucking thing, right? We just ignore that's bondage. You know, and I think as a white person, waking up to that and realizing like I'm the most duped of all of them if I keep going, right? Like if I keep playing with the program, it's like that fucking music video with all the we don't need no you know, like everybody's like in a factory assembly line. It's like the one kid who breaks the pattern is the free one, you know. It's like in order for us all to collectively heal and make change, we have to break the pattern. We have to acknowledge we cannot go on with our regularly scheduled programming. And
right.
that's where the freedom is.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's the deprogramming and the quitting of the programming. The NBA is over. Just stop the programming. Be like that. Yeah. So I mean, I could talk about that for like, I didn't even get into research. I mean, I just kind of like paraphrased our psychological process in the in versus the out group. But, you know, if I will say, you know, the field of psychology is deeply, deeply racist, past and present. And, you know, now we're starting to really expand the idea of trauma and look at how that affects people. And, you know, what we are finding is that incidences of race-related stress, whether, you know, somebody called you the N-word, or, you know, whether you watched a video of someone that looks like you being shot or, you know, harassed by the police, or, you know, whether a colleague or a friend just posted something insensitive. All of those things have significant additive effects on Black people's mental health. And more recently, a study has come out that's shown that those effects are particularly significant in the kiddos. And so that's why I study youth. You know, I would like to, you know, I'm a Cancer, like I'm very mothering, which sometimes people are surprised about, but I want to protect the babies. Like I want to set them up for the most successful life that they can have, and you know, and mitigate some of the realities that they're facing as Black and brown kiddos in our country and our society, and that by they're learning what they're learning, right, is like who they are isn't okay. And so like as an adult, imagine how much deprogramming they would have to do to reach, you know, this idea of mukta that we're talking about. So, you know, how can I mitigate that negative learning process early on? That's what I'm working on, so that they live longer and happier and healthier lives.
You're a fucking badass, Devin Banks. I'm glad you're on this planet, and I'm glad you're doing that very important work, and super grateful for you.
Oh, thank you. I'm very grateful for you as well.
Well, speaking of psychology, I asked you a question a few weeks ago. Who is your favorite psychologist? And you've arrived at a conclusion.
Well, like at the time, I was like, I don't want to pick a white guy, but like that's pretty much all that's in our textbook. So there are a couple amazing Black scholars who are doing fantastic work out there with regard to health equity. Like Rheeda Walker has an amazing book about Black mental health. She's a psychologist. Riana Anderson is doing amazing work in Detroit and now on Zoom all over the country for Black mental health and Black youth. So those are like my contemporary faves. I think, you know, if I'm going to go into a textbook, my favorite's got to be Carl Jung. Because, you know, he was a spiritualist. He was all about this idea of not only the personal conscious, but the collective unconscious, and how those interact with the ego, and really kind of moved away from Freud's idea that everything, like all psychological issues, were about repressed childhood sexual desires, and really was like, why don't we actually look at what people are going through right this second, and how that's contributing to their identity and their consciousness. And so, you know, he said some pretty spiritually profound things, like, you know, who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. Mm-hmm. Which goes back to our idea, you know, the idea of this deep remembering, this unlearning of all the stuff that we learned in order to get to freedom, to liberation, whatever that might mean.
God bless something, Devin. You're brilliant. Well, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. You summed that up way better than I could, as I knew you would, which is why you're here. Is there anything you want to share about, I mean, do you want people to be in contact with you? Do you want people to follow you? I don't really know, you know, what your interest in that whole realm is.
Sure, why not? I have a public academic Twitter. Mm-hmm. It's PhD_Banks. It's supposed to be on a play on the words, like, you know, D Banks. My friends used to call me that when I was in college. Okay. Where I mostly talk about racial justice, health equity, and ivory tower research bullshit. It's a good old mix. And yeah, you know, if you are a nerd, and you can find me on Google Scholar, ResearchGate, and all the other places that you read too long scientific research papers.
My God.
But definitely don't do that unless you know what either of those things are.
I don't, but I'm probably going to create a Google Scholar account just to follow you.
My mom, when I first started this career, was like, and published my first paper, was like, oh my God, I can't wait to read it. And I can't wait to read your dissertation. And I was like, I don't really think that, okay. Yeah, all right, good luck out there. Because, you know, and then 2 paragraphs in, she'd be like, what do these 7 words mean?
And then you shipped her a dictionary and were like, best wishes, mother. I cannot break down the whole thing.
Oh, I was like, yeah, you gotta wait. You're like, let me just paraphrase. I'll just let you know what we found.
I wouldn't get through the first sentence without having to Google every word, I'm sure, but I'm gonna try. No, I'm really curious. Well, is there anything you want to share, you know, last bits of information or wisdom, or, you know, anything?
You know, take care of yourselves out there. Breathe. Remove your tongue from the top of your mouth and unclench your jaw. Like,
I needed to do that right then.
Yeah. Take deeper breaths into your lungs. Don't watch videos of violence against people who look like you, whether that's like women or Black people or Muslims or whatever. And that's my personal medical advice of the day. You know, and step away from the news when you can. Like, and don't feel guilty if you're not like engaged in the effort all the time. You know, self-love, self-care is a radical act.
Well, I sure do love you. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your brilliance with us.
Thank you. I love you.